Number 1. Charles Cullen, the most prolific serial killer in American nursing history, whose 16-year killing spree claimed at least 40 confirmed lives and may have reached 400 victims. A case that fundamentally transformed hospital oversight across the entire healthcare system. Born in West Orange, New Jersey in February 1960, Cullen endured a childhood marked by profound trauma, including his father's death when he was just 7 months old, followed by a series of losses that would shape his psychological development in disturbing ways. His mother was killed in a car accident when he was 17, his 9 siblings scattered to various relatives, and Cullen himself attempted suicide multiple times before graduating from high school, behaviors that somehow never triggered the intervention that might have prevented decades of carnage. After serving 4 years in the United States Navy, where he faced repeated disciplinary issues and was ultimately discharged for unspecified psychiatric reasons, Cullen enrolled in the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey, completing his degree in 1987 and beginning what would become the deadliest nursing career in recorded history. Cullen's first nursing position at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, provided the template for his subsequent method of operation, one he would refine and repeat across 9 different hospitals over the following 16 years. At St. Barnabas, Cullen began accessing medication supplies, particularly digoxin, a cardiac drug that in excessive doses causes fatal arrhythmias, and administering lethal injections to patients he judged to be suffering or beyond help, a grotesque perversion of nursing's healing mission that he somehow rationalized as mercy killing despite the complete absence of patient consent, family notification, or medical necessity. When suspicions arose after several unexpected deaths on his watch, Cullen simply moved to another facility, his nursing license intact, his record unblemished by the whispered concerns that followed him like shadows. From St. Barnabas, he migrated to Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, where he murdered at least 3 elderly women with deliberate digoxin overdoses in 1991, then to Hunterdon Medical Center, then Morristown Memorial Hospital, then Centennial Medical Center, then Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, each transition representing not a fresh start but a new hunting ground. The pattern that finally ended Cullen's career emerged at Somerset Medical Center in 2003, when the hospital's newly implemented medication tracking system flagged an alarming pattern of unauthorized access to digoxin and insulin by a single nurse across multiple patient deaths. Hospital administrators, confronted with data showing Cullen had accessed medications for patients not assigned to his care, faced a critical decision. Rather than immediately contacting law enforcement, they conducted an internal investigation that spanned several months, during which Cullen continued working and potentially continued killing, a delay that would generate profound controversy and multiple wrongful death lawsuits. When Somerset finally terminated Cullen in October 2003 and reported their findings to authorities, investigators from the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office began building a case that would eventually encompass hundreds of suspicious deaths across Cullen's entire employment history. The scope of Cullen's crimes defied comprehension. During extensive interrogations conducted in December 2003 and January 2004, Cullen confessed to murdering between 30 and 40 patients across his career, though he suggested the true number might approach 400, a figure investigators could neither fully confirm nor entirely dismiss given the limitations of record-keeping and the natural causes attributed to many hospital deaths. His methods evolved from digoxin to insulin, both drugs difficult to detect in postmortem toxicology, particularly in elderly patients with multiple health conditions. He targeted patients he perceived as suffering, but also selected victims based on convenience, proximity, and his own fluctuating moods, making a mockery of any consistent angel of mercy justification. The investigation required exhumations of multiple bodies, complex toxicological analysis, and the painful notification of hundreds of families who had believed their loved ones died of natural causes. Cullen's cooperation with prosecutors, provided in exchange for protection from the death penalty, yielded detailed confessions that helped investigators identify specific victims and understand his operational methods, though his memory proved unreliable for many cases and his psychological state remained disturbingly flat throughout the process. In March 2006, he pleaded guilty to murdering 13 patients at Somerset Medical Center and 2 at St. Barnabas Medical Center, receiving 11 consecutive life sentences that totaled 397 years in prison, ensuring he would die incarcerated. Additional guilty pleas in Pennsylvania for murders committed at hospitals in Allentown and Bethlehem brought further life sentences. The Cullen case triggered sweeping reforms in hospital credentialing, with New Jersey and numerous other states implementing mandatory reporting systems for healthcare workers suspected of misconduct, limitations on nurses' access to dangerous medications, and requirements for thorough employment history verification that might have intercepted Cullen's hospital hopping pattern decades earlier. Cullen remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, his case continuing to serve as the definitive example of how systemic failures in healthcare oversight can enable predatory behavior, and how the trust placed in nursing professionals can be weaponized with catastrophic consequences. Number 2, Beverley Allitt, Britain's most infamous nurse and the perpetrator of crimes so calculated that she earned the moniker the Angel of Death. A case that fundamentally altered pediatric care protocols and raised impossible questions about how a caregiver could transform hospital wards into killing fields. Born in October 1968 in the Lincolnshire village of Corby Glen, Allitt's early life presented contradictory signals. She trained as a nursery nurse, demonstrated apparent dedication to childcare, yet exhibited patterns of attention-seeking behavior that would later assume lethal dimensions, including multiple unexplained accidents, sudden illnesses, and a documented history of Munchausen syndrome by proxy that she directed at herself and others before her nursing career. Her training at Grantham and District Hospital School of Nursing proceeded without major incident, though retrospectively, instructors noted her unnerving enthusiasm for emergency situations and her apparent comfort with patient distress that disturbed more experienced colleagues, observations filed away rather than investigated. Qualifying as a state-enrolled nurse in 1991, Allitt secured a position on the children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, where during a 59-day period between February and April of that year, she would attack 13 children, murdering 4 and causing permanent brain damage to several others. Allitt's methods demonstrated chilling sophistication for someone with limited medical training, suggesting either remarkable latent capability or extensive premeditation that remains poorly understood. She employed insulin injections to induce hypoglycemic comas, air embolisms introduced through intravenous lines to cause cardiac arrest, and massive potassium overdoses that stopped young hearts with clinical efficiency, rotating her methods presumably to obscure patterns that might trigger investigation. The children she targeted ranged from infancy to early adolescence, selected not by demographic characteristics but by accessibility, those in isolated rooms, those recently post-operative, those whose conditions might plausibly deteriorate without raising immediate alarm. Her attacks generated a crisis atmosphere on the ward, with experienced physicians expressing bewilderment at the cluster of catastrophic events, the apparent randomness of victim selection, and the failure of intensive interventions to stabilize what should have been manageable conditions. The pattern that ultimately exposed Allitt emerged from statistical impossibility rather than direct observation. Dr. Charlotte Wright, a consultant pediatrician reviewing ward records, identified that Allitt had been present for every suspicious incident, a correlation so pronounced that it transcended coincidence even before toxicological evidence confirmed deliberate poisoning. When hospital administrators contacted police in April 1991, investigators faced the unprecedented challenge of building a criminal case against a nurse attacking children in her care, with limited forensic protocols for the specific toxins involved and the necessity of protecting ongoing pediatric care while conducting their inquiry. Allitt was suspended pending investigation, then arrested in May following analysis of medical records and witness statements that established opportunity, means, and increasingly clear motive in her pattern of emergency creation followed by heroic response. The investigation revealed that Allitt's crimes extended beyond her nursing duties into elaborate deceptions that nearly destroyed several colleagues wrongfully suspected of her attacks. She had planted evidence, manufactured witness accounts, and actively participated in the persecution of innocent nurses, behavior that suggested not merely homicidal ideation but profound sadistic enjoyment of the chaos she created. Expert psychological evaluation diagnosed Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a controversial diagnosis in which caregivers fabricate or induce illness in dependence to assume the sick role by proxy, though Allitt's case exceeded typical presentations in its lethality and the ages of her victims. Some analysts have suggested antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy as more comprehensive explanations for her complete absence of remorse and active pursuit of secondary gain through others' suffering. In November 1992, Allitt stood trial at Nottingham Crown Court for murder, attempted murder, and grievous bodily harm, her defense asserting innocence despite overwhelming evidence and her own contradictory statements to investigators. The jury's guilty verdict on all counts, delivered after 4 days of deliberation on May 28, 1993, resulted in 13 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment, with the trial judge recommending a minimum term of 40 years, a severity virtually unprecedented for a female offender in British history and reflective of the particular horror accorded crimes against children by entrusted caregivers. Allitt appealed both conviction and sentence unsuccessfully, then disappeared into the prison system where she has remained for 3 decades. Her case continuously cited in medical ethics training and pediatric nursing education as the definitive warning against insufficient supervision and the dangers of diagnostic overshadowing in healthcare settings. Subsequent legal actions by victims' families established systemic failures in Allitt's hiring and supervision, with particular criticism directed at her previous employers who had documented concerns about her conduct without communicating them to Grantham Hospital. The Allitt case prompted wholesale restructuring of pediatric ward protocols in Britain, including mandatory 2-nurse verification for medication administration, enhanced monitoring of high-risk patients, and the development of rapid response teams to investigate unusual clinical events, reforms that have undoubtedly saved lives but that arrived too late for the children entrusted to her care. Number 3, Kristen Gilbert, whose transformation from decorated United States Army nurse to serial killer of her own patients represented a devastating betrayal of military medical ethics and generated one of the most complex trials in American criminal history, ultimately resulting in death penalty convictions that were subsequently commuted to life without possibility of release. Born Kristen Strickland in Fall River, Massachusetts in November 1967, Gilbert's early adulthood suggested conventional achievement rather than emerging pathology. She enlisted in the United States Army in 1986, trained as a nurse at the University of Maryland and Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and by 1989 held a position as licensed practical nurse at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts, a facility providing long-term care to aging veterans with complex medical conditions. Her initial performance evaluations were exemplary, her military bearing impressive, her technical skills sound. She received commendations for her response to medical emergencies, a tragic irony given that she was systematically creating the very crises she appeared to master. Gilbert's criminal activity commenced in 1990 and accelerated dramatically over the following 2 years, encompassing at least 40 confirmed medical emergencies on Ward C-5 where she worked the night shift, emergencies that resulted in at least 9 confirmed deaths and numerous near-fatal incidents. Her weapon of choice was epinephrine, the synthetic form of adrenaline used to treat cardiac arrest, which in massive intravenous doses induces fatal heart arrhythmias. She also employed potassium chloride, a substance so dangerous that its use outside monitored cardiac settings is strictly controlled. Gilbert's pattern was distinctive and eventually self-defeating. She would inject patients during quiet night shifts, then summon assistance with apparent alarm, participating in resuscitation efforts with conspicuous competence that drew praise from colleagues while obscuring her responsibility for the initial collapse. The concentration of deaths during her shifts, initially attributed to coincidence or the natural progression of terminal conditions, gradually generated suspicion as statistical analysis revealed probabilities that defied random distribution. The investigation that exposed Gilbert combined old-fashioned police work with emerging forensic capabilities in toxicology and statistical analysis. In 1996, VA investigators, responding to mounting internal concerns, discovered a pattern of missing epinephrine vials corresponding precisely to Gilbert's shifts and the subsequent patient deaths. A contemporaneous inventory revealed she had signed out 28 vials of epinephrine in a 6-month period, quantities vastly exceeding any legitimate medical use. When investigators accessed her personnel file, they discovered additional disturbing patterns. Gilbert had been transferred from previous positions following patient deaths, had received psychiatric treatment for depression and suicidal ideation, and had fabricated elements of her educational and military background. red flags that had somehow failed to trigger comprehensive review of her clinical practice. The VA contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1996, initiating a joint investigation that would span 2 years and require unprecedented coordination between medical, forensic, and criminal justice professionals. The criminal case against Gilbert presented extraordinary challenges in both evidence and legal theory. Many of her victims were elderly veterans with significant comorbidities, making definitive attribution of death to epinephrine poisoning difficult even with toxicological evidence. Several bodies required exhumation for adequate testing, generating both technical complications and profound emotional distress for families who had believed their loved ones died peacefully. The prosecution, led by Assistant United States Attorney William Welch, constructed a case combining direct toxicological evidence from several victims, circumstantial evidence of Gilbert's access and opportunity, and expert testimony regarding the statistical improbability of the death pattern occurring naturally. Gilbert's defense, mounted by high-profile attorney Harry Miles, attacked each evidentiary component while suggesting that overwork, inadequate staffing, and coincidental clustering explained the mortality pattern without requiring criminal explanation. The trial that commenced in January 2001 at United States District Court in Springfield, Massachusetts, lasted approximately 2 months and generated intense national attention, both for the disturbing nature of the charges and for the rarity of female serial killers in American criminal history. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Toxicologist Dr. Maria Laverick demonstrated epinephrine presence in victims remains at levels inconsistent with therapeutic administration. Statistician Dr. Stephen Gelbeck calculated the odds of the death pattern occurring naturally at less than 1 in 100 million, and former colleagues testified to Gilbert's disturbing comments about creating emergencies and her fascination with resuscitation procedures. The defense's attempts to attribute deaths to natural causes, medication errors, or alternative suspects collapsed under cross-examination, particularly when Gilbert's former husband testified to her admissions and her possession of stolen epinephrine vials discovered during their divorce proceedings. The jury convicted Gilbert on March 14, 2001, of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder, returning death penalty recommendations under federal law that permitted capital punishment for murders committed on federal property. Judge Michael Ponzer formally imposed death sentences in July 2001, though he expressed personal opposition to capital punishment while acknowledging his obligation to follow jury findings and applicable law. The subsequent appeals process, spanning nearly 2 decades, generated significant legal precedent regarding federal death penalty procedures, psychiatric evaluation of capital defendants, and the admissibility of statistical evidence in criminal trials. Ultimately, a federal appeals court vacated the death sentences in 2003 based on constitutional deficiencies in jury instruction, and in 2008, the Department of Justice declined to pursue renewed capital prosecution. Gilbert was resentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, a term she is currently serving at Federal Medical Center, Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, where her case continues to be studied for its implications regarding healthcare worker screening, night shift supervision, and the psychological profiles of medical murderers. The Northampton VA implemented sweeping reforms in medication security, shift supervision, and mortality review that have influenced healthcare protocols nationwide. Though the fundamental vulnerability Gilbert exploited, the trust placed in nighttime caregivers by vulnerable patients remains incompletely addressed. Number 4, Amy Archer-Gilligan, whose operation of the Archer Home for the Elderly and Infirm in Windsor, Connecticut during the early 20th century represented perhaps the most financially motivated medical murder spree in American history, with poisoned patients generating income through accelerated inheritance and repeated residency fees. In a case that helped establish forensic toxicology as a legitimate scientific discipline. Born Amy Duggan in October 1868 in Milton, Connecticut, she trained as a nurse in the 1890s and married James Archer in 1897, establishing with him a boarding house for elderly widows and invalids that would evolve into the murderous enterprise that consumes her historical reputation. James Archer's death in 1910, initially attributed to natural causes but later suspected to involve arsenic poisoning, left Amy in sole control of the increasingly profitable nursing home. a euphemism for what was essentially a death boarding house where residents paid substantial sums, often their life savings, for care that frequently proved fatal. The Archer home's business model, as it emerged through subsequent investigation, represented a grotesque optimization of mortality for profit. Amy Archer-Gilligan advertised extensively in local newspapers, targeting elderly individuals with moderate assets and limited family support, offering comfortable rooms, professional nursing care, and promises of dignified final years. Upon admission, residents typically signed over assets or made substantial advance payments for lifetime care, arrangements that created powerful financial incentive for their premature deaths. Between 1907 and 1917, approximately 60 residents died at the Archer home, a mortality rate that vastly exceeded comparable institutions and that generated increasing suspicion in the small community of Windsor, particularly as Amy rapidly remarried following James Archer's death, only to see her second husband Michael Gilligan die under strikingly similar circumstances in 1914. The frequency of deaths, the apparent health of many deceased residents upon admission, and Amy's remarkable financial success. She was known to carry large sums and make substantial purchases, finally prompted formal complaint to authorities in 1916. The investigation that exposed Archer-Gilligan required innovative forensic techniques, as arsenic poisoning, her apparent method of choice, leaves distinctive but subtle pathological markers that were poorly understood in early 20th century medicine. When Windsor police exhumed several bodies from the Archer home's associated cemetery, they encountered a local physician, Dr. Howard King, who had been suspicious of the mortality pattern for years but lacked definitive evidence to support his concerns. His assistance proved crucial in identifying the classic signs of chronic arsenic poisoning, including gastric inflammation, liver damage, and characteristic raindrop skin pigmentation. The state's attorney, Hugh Alcorn, engaged the services of Alexander Gettler, the pioneering toxicologist whose work would establish American forensic science, to develop reliable quantitative methods for arsenic detection in human remains. Gettler's meticulous analysis demonstrated lethal arsenic concentrations in multiple bodies, providing evidentiary foundation that would prove decisive at trial. The case against Archer-Gilligan, when presented at Hartford County Court in June 1917, combined this emerging scientific evidence with devastating testimony regarding her business practices and personal behavior. Former residents described her systematic administration of tonics and medicines that preceded deaths, her pressure on families to arrange quick funerals without autopsy, and her remarkable acquisition of resident property through wills drafted under her influence. Financial records demonstrated income patterns directly correlated with resident mortality, with peaks following deaths of wealthy boarders. Her defense, mounted by prominent attorney T. Emmett Quinn, attempted to attribute deaths to natural causes endemic to elderly populations and to suggest that arsenic contamination of well water or medical supplies might explain toxicological findings, arguments that collapsed under Gettler's demonstration that arsenic distribution in bodies was inconsistent with environmental exposure and precisely consistent with deliberate administration. The jury's guilty verdict on second-degree murder charges, delivered on June 18, 1917 in Michael Gilligan's death, resulted in a sentence of life imprisonment rather than the death penalty the prosecution had sought, a mercy perhaps reflecting gender assumptions of the era despite the calculated greed evident in her crimes. Archer-Gilligan's subsequent legal history was complex and disturbing. She was initially committed to the Connecticut State Hospital for the insane after developing apparent dementia, escaped conviction in other deaths when the state declined to pursue additional charges, and reportedly recovered sufficient mental function to operate a commissary within the hospital, raising enduring questions about the authenticity of her psychiatric symptoms. She remained institutionalized until her death in 1962 at age 93. Having survived most of her victims by decades and having witnessed the evolution of forensic toxicology her case helped create. The Archer home murders generated sustained national attention, inspiring the successful Broadway play Arsenic and Old Lace by Joseph Kesselring. Though the comedic treatment somewhat obscured the genuine horror of systematic predation upon society's most vulnerable members, modern analysis of the case emphasizes its significance in establishing medicine and law enforcement collaboration, validating toxicological evidence in criminal proceedings, and demonstrating how financial incentives can corrupt caregiving relationships, lessons that remain urgently relevant in contemporary debates about elder care regulation and oversight. Number 5. Orville Lynn Majors, whose systematic murder of patients at Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, Indiana during the mid-1990s represented one of the most methodical nursing serial killings in American history, with statistical analysis demonstrating a mortality rate during his shifts approximately 10 times higher than when he was absent, a pattern that persisted for nearly 2 years before intervention. Born in 1956 in Clinton, Indiana itself, Majors grew up in the community he would later terrorize, training as a licensed practical nurse at Indiana State University and returning to work at the same hospital where he had been born, a local connection that initially generated trust and protected him from scrutiny, even as death accumulated around his practice. His nursing career, which began in earnest in 1991 after earlier employment in various service positions, showed no evident abnormalities during its initial years. He was known as competent if somewhat distant, without the dramatic behavioral fluctuations that sometimes signal emerging criminal pathology in healthcare workers. Majors' homicidal activity appears to have commenced in 1993 and accelerated dramatically in 1994, encompassing approximately 130 suspicious deaths at a small community hospital that typically experienced fewer than 100 deaths annually across all causes. His method, as subsequently determined through extensive investigation, involved injection of potassium chloride and possibly epinephrine, substances that cause cardiac arrest with minimal forensic signature in elderly patients with underlying cardiovascular disease. He selected victims primarily based on convenience, targeting patients who were alone, sedated, or recently transferred to his care, though some evidence suggested he particularly targeted patients he perceived as difficult or demanding. The concentration of deaths during his shifts, particularly during evening and night hours when staffing was reduced, eventually generated concern among colleagues who noted his apparent comfort with patient death and his unusual interest in the resuscitation equipment he so frequently deployed. The formal investigation commenced in late 1995, when hospital administrators, responding to mounting internal reports and the statistical impossibility of the mortality pattern, contacted the Indiana State Police and requested comprehensive review of deaths during Majors' employment. The resulting inquiry, spanning nearly 3 years and involving exhumation of more than 15 bodies, complex toxicological analysis, and extensive statistical modeling, demonstrated that Majors' presence was the single strongest predictor of patient death at Vermilion County Hospital, stronger than age, diagnosis, or any legitimate medical variable. Detective James Bland and Indiana State Police investigators constructed a case combining the statistical foundation with specific toxicological findings in several victims, witness reports of Majors' behavior, and comparable case analysis from other nursing serial killings that established both the possibility and the typical patterns of such crimes. The prosecution of Majors, led by Vermilion County Prosecutor Mark Greenwell, faced the challenge of presenting statistical evidence to a rural Indiana jury while maintaining focus on individual victims and their families' losses. The trial, conducted at Vermilion County Circuit Court in Terre Haute beginning October 1999, featured testimony from Dr. George Lundberg, former editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, who explained the statistical methodology that identified Majors as an outlier beyond any plausible innocent explanation, from toxicologists who demonstrated potassium chloride presence in victim remains, and from nurses who described Majors' disturbing comments and behaviors, including his statement that certain patients needed to die and his apparent satisfaction when resuscitation efforts failed. The defense, emphasizing the natural deaths common in elderly hospitalized populations and suggesting that Majors was targeted due to homophobia. He was openly gay in a conservative community, attempted to transform the case into persecution by statistics rather than evidence of crime. The jury convicted Majors on October 18, 1999, of 6 counts of murder, rejecting the higher charges prosecutors had sought for additional deaths where toxicological evidence was less definitive. Judge Ernest Yelton imposed consecutive sentences totaling 360 years in prison, explicitly ensuring Majors would never be released regardless of subsequent legal developments. The conviction was affirmed on appeal, though Majors continued to assert innocence through multiple post-conviction petitions, all unsuccessful, maintaining that he was a competent nurse victimized by statistical misunderstanding and community prejudice. Incarcerated at Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Majors has become a case study in nursing education regarding the warning signs of predatory behavior and the importance of systematic mortality review. The Vermilion County Hospital implemented comprehensive reforms in shift supervision, medication access, and incident reporting that have influenced rural healthcare nationwide. The Majors case particularly demonstrates how statistical analysis, properly applied, can identify criminal patterns invisible to conventional observation, while also illustrating the dangers of over-reliance on statistical correlation without adequate investigative confirmation, both lessons that continue to shape healthcare quality assurance and criminal investigation methodologies. Number 6. Donald Harvey, whose decades-long killing spree spanning multiple states, multiple healthcare facilities, and multiple methods of murder established him as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, with confirmed and confessed murders exceeding 87 victims and credible estimates suggesting well over 100, a case that exposed catastrophic failures in healthcare worker oversight and criminal justice cross-jurisdictional coordination. Born in April 1952 in Butler County, Ohio, Harvey's childhood and adolescence presented numerous warning signs that went unheeded. Documented animal cruelty, fire setting, persistent bedwetting beyond normal developmental periods, and early expressions of homicidal ideation that should have triggered intervention under any competent mental health assessment. His initial adult employment included stints at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky, where he later confessed to murdering at least a dozen patients during 1970 to 1971, and the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Hospital, where additional deaths occurred. Remarkably, he was dismissed from Marymount for unrelated theft and from the VA for attendance issues, but in neither case were patient deaths investigated despite their concentration during his employment. Harvey's longest and deadliest period of employment occurred at Cincinnati's Drake Memorial Hospital, where he worked as an orderly and nurse's aide from 1972 to 1982, with subsequent readmission in 1984 following an interval of employment at yet another facility where additional deaths occurred. At Drake, Harvey refined the diverse methods that characterized his criminal career: cyanide and arsenic poisoning, intentional suffocation with pillows or plastic bags, injection of hepatitis B serum to cause fatal liver disease, and manipulation of ventilator settings to induce respiratory failure in dependent patients. His victim selection was notably indiscriminate, encompassing patients he judged to be suffering, those who annoyed him, those whose deaths might benefit him financially through theft, and apparently random individuals who simply presented opportunity. This variability has complicated psychological analysis, with some authorities emphasizing his claims of mercy killing while others note the evident sadistic pleasure he derived from death and the diversity of motives evident in his methods. The investigation that finally exposed Harvey originated not from healthcare oversight but from medical examiner curiosity. In March 1987, Dr. Lee Lehman, Hamilton County Medical Examiner, conducted an autopsy on John Powell, a Drake Hospital patient whose sudden death occurred shortly after Harvey had been transferred to his ward. Lehman detected a suspicious odor characteristic of cyanide poisoning and ordered toxicological testing that confirmed lethal cyanide concentrations. When Cincinnati police identified Harvey as the orderly with recent patient access, they discovered an extensive criminal history including multiple hospital dismissals, a 1985 guilty plea to burglary of a patient's home, and consistent patterns of patient death across his entire employment history, information that had never been systematically compiled or shared between jurisdictions. Harvey, confronted with the cyanide evidence, confessed extensively to Cincinnati police and subsequently to prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions, providing detailed accounts of murders spanning 17 years and 3 states. The legal proceedings against Harvey were extraordinarily complex, requiring coordination between Kentucky, Ohio, and federal authorities, each with different interests and evidentiary capabilities. Harvey ultimately pleaded guilty to 24 murders in Ohio, receiving 3 consecutive life sentences with explicit agreement that he would never be eligible for parole. He received additional life sentences in Kentucky for 8 confirmed murders there, and through his extensive cooperation, assisted in identifying numerous additional victims whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes. His motivation for cooperation remains debated. Some analysts suggest genuine remorse. Others note the protection from death penalty and the opportunity for notoriety that his confessions provided. Harvey was incarcerated at Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, where in September 2017 he was severely beaten by a fellow inmate and died 2 days later from his injuries, a violent end that denied further opportunity for psychological study, and closed a case that had generated more questions than answers about how such extensive criminal activity could persist undetected across multiple healthcare institutions. The systemic failures exposed by the Harvey case were comprehensive and disturbing. No healthcare facility had conducted adequate background checks or verified employment history, allowing him to move between institutions without reference to previous dismissals. No regulatory body had identified the pattern of deaths associated with his employment. No criminal justice agency had connected the dots across jurisdictions even after his 1985 burglary conviction should have flagged him for scrutiny. In response, Ohio and numerous other states implemented mandatory fingerprint-based criminal background checks for healthcare workers, interstate employment verification systems, and requirements for reporting of unusual patient deaths that might indicate criminal activity. Reforms that came decades too late for Harvey's victims, but that have undoubtedly prevented subsequent predation by similarly situated offenders. Number 7. Genene Jones, whose murder of pediatric patients at Behar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, and subsequent killing spree at a small-town pediatric clinic represented perhaps the most disturbing case of pediatric nursing serial murder in American history, combining extraordinary death tolls with systematic obstruction of investigation that protected her across multiple employment transitions and nearly prevented justice entirely. Born in July 1950 in San Antonio itself, Jones pursued nursing with apparent dedication that masked profound psychological disturbance, graduating from St. Philip's College and securing a position in the pediatric intensive care unit at Behar County Hospital, now University Hospital, in 1978, where her technical competence and apparent emotional investment in critically ill children initially generated admiration rather than suspicion. The PICU environment, with its inherent mortality and complex medical conditions, provided ideal cover for deliberate killing. Jones employed succinylcholine and possibly other paralytic agents to induce respiratory arrest in infants and young children, then participated in resuscitation efforts with dramatic intensity that drew attention to her heroism, while obscuring her responsibility for the initial collapse. The death rate in Behar County Hospital's PICU during Jones' employment was approximately 10 times higher than comparable units nationwide, a disparity so striking that it generated internal concern and, by 1981, formal review by hospital administrators and the Texas Department of Health. That review, however, collapsed under Jones' aggressive counterattack. She accused colleagues of jealousy, sexual discrimination, and professional incompetence, filed formal complaints against those who questioned her, and cultivated relationships with influential physicians who defended her against what they characterized as persecution of a dedicated nurse. When the investigation concluded in 1982 with identification of suspicious patterns but insufficient evidence for criminal charges, Jones was merely asked to resign, a resolution that enabled her immediate employment at another San Antonio facility and, subsequently, at the Kerrville Pediatric Clinic in the small hill country community of Kerrville, where her predation continued with devastating consequences. At Kerrville Pediatric Clinic, Jones worked with Dr. Kathleen Holland, a young physician who had recently established her practice and who initially welcomed Jones' apparent expertise with critically ill children. Between 1982 and 1983, 15 children under the clinic's care experienced sudden, unexplained respiratory arrests requiring emergency hospitalization. 14 survived, but Chelsea McClellan, a 15-month-old patient, died on September 17, 1982, despite intensive resuscitation efforts during which Jones administered an injection that Holland had not ordered. Dr. Holland, increasingly suspicious, preserved a blood sample from Chelsea that subsequent analysis would prove contained toxic levels of succinylcholine, establishing definitive evidence of deliberate poisoning. When she confronted Jones regarding unauthorized medication access and inconsistent accounts of the McClellan death, Jones resigned and, characteristically, immediately sought employment elsewhere, this time at a hospital in her original San Antonio territory. The investigation that finally intercepted Jones required extraordinary persistence by Dr. Holland, who refused to accept the medical examiner's initial attribution of Chelsea's death to natural causes and demanded comprehensive toxicological analysis that ultimately identified succinylcholine. When San Antonio prosecutors learned of these findings and connected them to the earlier Behar County Hospital investigation, they assembled a case combining the Kerrville killing with evidence of numerous additional suspicious deaths, though the succinylcholine's rapid metabolic breakdown prevented retrospective definitive proof in many cases. Jones was indicted in 1984 for Chelsea McClellan's murder and for injury to another Kerrville patient, with prosecutors planning subsequent charges for additional deaths once the initial convictions were secured, a strategy that was disrupted by an unforeseen legal development that would nearly permit her release. The trial of Genene Jones at Kerr County District Court in 1985 generated intense national attention and complex legal maneuvering. Prosecutor Ron Sutton constructed a case emphasizing the scientific evidence of deliberate poisoning, Jones' pattern of being present during numerous unexplained emergencies, and her history of suspicious patient deaths across multiple employers. The defense, led by attorney Chester Schulke, attempted to attribute deaths to underlying medical conditions to suggest that Dr. Holland had framed Jones out of professional jealousy, and to exploit weaknesses in the chain of custody for the crucial blood sample. The jury convicted Jones of murder and injury to a child in February 1985, delivering sentences of 99 years and 60 years respectively, with the trial judge ordering that sentences be served consecutively rather than concurrently, a critical decision given subsequent events. In 2017, as Jones approached mandatory release under Texas sentencing laws of the 1980s that provided credit for good behavior, prosecutors in San Antonio engaged in extraordinary legal efforts to prevent her freedom. They identified and indicted her for the 1981 death of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer at Behar County Hospital, a case that had been investigated but not previously charged due to evidentiary limitations that new analysis and Jones' own statements might overcome. This indictment, secured just days before her scheduled release, ensured she would remain incarcerated pending trial on the new charge. In 2018, Jones pleaded guilty to Joshua Sawyer's murder, receiving a life sentence that definitively precludes release, and subsequently pleaded guilty to additional charges related to another Behar County patient, ensuring incarceration until her death. The Genene Jones case generated fundamental reforms in Texas healthcare oversight, including mandatory reporting of healthcare worker suspicions to state licensing boards, restrictions on employment of nurses with history of patient death, and enhanced scrutiny of high-mortality healthcare units, reforms that have been widely adopted nationally. Her case remains the definitive study in how determined predators can exploit systemic vulnerabilities, how professional solidarity can obstruct necessary investigation, and how persistent advocacy by individual physicians and prosecutors can eventually overcome institutional resistance to acknowledging healthcare-associated murder. Number 8. Richard Angelo, whose transformation from promising nursing student to serial poisoner at Good Samaritan Hospital in West Islip, New York represented a particularly disturbing variant of nursing serial killing, one in which the perpetrator created medical crises specifically to demonstrate his competence in resolving them, generating numerous near-fatal incidents alongside confirmed deaths in a pattern that exposed critical vulnerabilities in hospital supervision and medication. Security. Born in June 1962 in Long Island itself, Angelo's path to nursing reflected genuine intellectual capability. He graduated summa cum laude from the State University of New York at Farmingdale's nursing program in 1987 and secured a position at Good Samaritan Hospital, a well-regarded facility where his technical skills and apparent dedication generated rapid advancement to the critical care unit. His initial performance was exemplary by conventional metrics. He volunteered for difficult assignments, demonstrated remarkable success in stabilizing crashing patients, and expressed ambitions for advanced practice that seemed entirely appropriate to his capabilities. Angelo's criminal method, as subsequently determined through investigation and his own admissions, involved injection of pavulon, a potent paralytic agent used in surgical anesthesia, into patients' intravenous lines when they were alone and unobserved. The drug induces complete neuromuscular paralysis while preserving consciousness, creating the appearance of respiratory or cardiac arrest that would prompt emergency intervention. Angelo would then discover the crisis and summon assistance, participating in resuscitation with conspicuous competence that drew praise from colleagues and supervisors. When patients survived, they often reported terrifying experiences of conscious paralysis interpreted as near-death phenomena, while deaths were attributed to underlying medical conditions that had generated their initial hospitalization. Between January and October 1987, Angelo generated at least 25 medical emergencies on his unit, with at least 6 confirmed deaths and numerous additional patients suffering permanent injury from prolonged hypoxia during the induced arrests. The investigation that exposed Angelo originated from patient testimony rather than institutional oversight. In October 1987, patients Joe and Karen Fenn recognized each other in the hospital and discovered they had both experienced identical terrifying symptoms of conscious paralysis while under Angelo's care. When Joe Fenn reported his suspicions to hospital administrators, they initially dismissed his concerns but eventually contacted Suffolk County Police after additional patient reports accumulated. Detectives, working with hospital pharmacists, identified suspicious patterns of Pavulon access by Angelo. He had signed out quantities vastly exceeding any legitimate clinical use, and secured a warrant to search his home, where they discovered vials of Pavulon, detailed notes on patient responses to his injections, and evidence of ongoing planning for additional attacks. Angelo, confronted with this evidence, provided extensive confessions that mixed apparent remorse with disturbing self-justification, claiming he had sought only to demonstrate his competence and never intended fatal outcomes despite selecting paralytic agents known to cause death without prompt intervention. The prosecution of Angelo at Suffolk County Court in 1989 emphasized the calculated nature of his crimes and the suffering he had inflicted on conscious victims, presenting testimony from survivors who described their experiences of conscious paralysis, from medical experts regarding the lethality of Pavulon administration outside controlled settings, and from colleagues who retrospectively recognized patterns in his behavior that should have triggered earlier intervention. The defense, led by attorney Peter Tiano, attempted to attribute Angelo's actions to psychological disturbance short of criminal responsibility, emphasizing his lack of conventional criminal motive and his apparent genuine commitment to nursing competence. Psychiatric experts testified regarding possible dissociative disorders or factitious behavior patterns that might explain his apparent self-contradiction between healing intentions and lethal methods. The jury rejected these defenses, convicting Angelo of 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of first-degree assault, and 6 counts of second-degree assault in January 1989. Judge Stuart Nam imposed sentences of 61 years to life, explicitly ensuring decades of incarceration before any possibility of parole consideration. Angelo's appeals, spanning more than a decade, generated significant legal precedent regarding the admissibility of confession evidence, the standards for psychiatric evaluation of criminal responsibility, and the appropriate sentencing for healthcare workers who exploit professional position. All appeals were unsuccessful, and Angelo remains incarcerated at Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, his scheduled parole eligibility in 2049 functionally equivalent to life without release given his current age and health status. The Angelo case prompted immediate reforms in hospital medication security, including removal of dangerous paralytic agents from general nursing access, requirements for 2-person verification of high-risk medication administration, and development of code teams independent of unit staff to reduce opportunities for manufactured heroics. These reforms, widely adopted across American hospitals, have significantly reduced vulnerability to similar exploitation. Psychologically, the case remains significant for its demonstration of how professional competence and criminal predation can coexist, how the desire for recognition and status can generate lethal behavior, and how institutional metrics of success in patient stabilization may obscure the manufactured nature of crises. Lessons that continue to inform healthcare quality assurance and personnel evaluation. Number 9. Elizabeth Wettlaufer, whose systematic murder of elderly nursing home residents across multiple Ontario facilities between 2007 and 2016 represented the deadliest healthcare serial killing in Canadian history and exposed catastrophic failures in regulatory oversight, institutional accountability, and professional monitoring that enabled her predation across nearly a decade despite numerous warning signs. Born Elizabeth Parker in June 1967 in Toronto, she trained as a registered nurse at Conestoga College and secured employment in long-term care, where her career was marked from its early stages by concerning patterns that somehow failed to trigger decisive intervention: medication errors, unexplained patient incidents, behavioral disturbances including admission of suicidal ideation and deliberate self-harm, and multiple psychiatric hospitalizations that should have prompted comprehensive review of her fitness for nursing practice. Her nursing license was suspended temporarily in 1995 following an incident of professional misconduct, reinstated with conditions she subsequently violated. Yet she continued to find employment across Ontario's strained long-term care system, where chronic staffing shortages created powerful incentives to overlook problematic history. Wettlaufer's homicidal activity, as she subsequently confessed and investigators confirmed, involved injection of lethal insulin overdoses into elderly residents with diabetes, or those whose deaths might be attributed to natural causes given their age and medical complexity. She targeted victims across 8 different nursing homes, selecting them based on accessibility, perceived suffering, and in some cases personal annoyance, though her victim selection showed no consistent pattern that might have generated specific suspicion. Between 2007 and 2016, she murdered at least 8 confirmed victims and attempted to murder numerous others, with the true total possibly higher given the frailty of her patient population and the frequency with which nursing home deaths go uninvestigated. Her methods were notably unsophisticated, involving insulin nodules she openly accessed and administered without verification, in environments where single-nurse medication administration was standard practice and where patient monitoring was insufficient to detect deliberate harm. The investigation that finally exposed Wettlaufer originated not from institutional oversight but from her own psychological unraveling. In September 2016, she voluntarily admitted herself to a psychiatric facility and, during treatment, disclosed to a mental health nurse that she had murdered patients with insulin injections. This disclosure, initially treated with appropriate skepticism given her psychiatric history, was subsequently reported to authorities who initiated investigation that confirmed her detailed confessions against medical records and toxicological evidence. The revelation that a registered nurse had murdered multiple patients across nearly a decade, undetected by any of the 8 facilities where she worked, by the College of Nurses of Ontario that regulated her practice, or by the healthcare system more broadly, generated immediate provincial crisis and public outcry that would drive fundamental restructuring of Ontario's long-term care oversight. The prosecution of Wettlaufer at Ontario Superior Court of Justice in 2017 proceeded through detailed examination of each confirmed murder, with prosecutors presenting evidence of insulin administration without medical order, of Wettlaufer's presence during each victim's decline, of her detailed confessions including information unknown to investigators, and of the systematic failures that had enabled her continued employment despite numerous red flags. Wettlaufer pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault in June 2017, with the plea agreement sparing her multiple trials while ensuring sentences that would preclude any possibility of release. Justice Bruce Thomas imposed consecutive life sentences with no eligibility for parole for 25 years, the maximum available under Canadian law, explicitly characterizing her crimes as abhorrent and a fundamental betrayal of trust. The public inquiry mandated by the Ontario government following Wettlaufer's conviction, chaired by Justice Eileen Gillies and reporting in 2019, documented systemic failures across multiple levels. Nursing homes that failed to share information about concerning incidents, regulatory bodies that prioritized confidentiality over public protection, professional associations that resisted mandatory reporting requirements, and a healthcare culture that minimized near-miss events and discouraged whistleblowing. The Gillies inquiry's 91 recommendations, substantially implemented through provincial legislation, established mandatory reporting of healthcare worker suspicions, comprehensive employment history verification requirements, enhanced medication security protocols, and whistleblower protections that have influenced long-term care policy across Canada and internationally. Wettlaufer is incarcerated at Grand Valley Institution for Women in Kitchener, Ontario, her case having generated the most comprehensive reform of Canadian healthcare worker oversight in history, while raising enduring questions about how such extensive criminal activity could persist undetected despite numerous opportunities for intervention. A pattern that suggests systemic vulnerabilities extending far beyond any individual facility or regulator. Number 10. Robert Franklin Stroud, whose transformation from convicted murderer to self-taught ornithologist and subsequent celebrity as the Birdman of Alcatraz has somewhat obscured the genuine brutality of his crimes, including the murder of a nurse at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary that represented not healthcare predation but the violent exploitation of care relationships that characterizes many of the most disturbing medical setting homicides. Born in January 1890 in Seattle, Washington, Stroud's early life included significant trauma and behavioral disturbance that presaged his criminal career. An abusive father, early alcohol use, and a pattern of violent response to perceived disrespect that generated his first serious criminal entanglement in 1909, when at age 19 he killed a bartender who had allegedly failed to pay a prostitute with whom Stroud was involved. Convicted of manslaughter, he began what would become 54 years of continuous incarceration, interrupted only by brief periods of freedom that invariably ended in violent recidivism. Stroud's most notorious crime occurred in 1916, during his imprisonment at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, where he had established himself as problematic but manageable through the alcohol smuggling operation he conducted with his mother's assistance. When Andrew Turner, a correctional officer, informed Stroud that his brother Charlie was being denied visitation privileges due to smuggling suspicions, Stroud fatally stabbed Turner in an attack sufficiently brutal to generate first-degree murder charges. Convicted and sentenced to hang, he was reprieved by President Woodrow Wilson following his mother's impassioned advocacy, with the sentence commuted to life imprisonment with solitary confinement. This reprieve, while saving Stroud's life, initiated the conditions that would generate his subsequent notoriety and eventual transformation into the Birdman. The murder that connects Stroud to this documentary's theme occurred in 1942, after 3 decades of increasingly famous solitary confinement during which he had become the world's leading authority on canary diseases through self-directed study and correspondence with ornithologists worldwide. Stroud had established a sophisticated laboratory in his solitary cell, complete with equipment his mother and various supporters had provided, and had developed genuine scientific expertise that generated academic respect despite his criminal status. However, he remained fundamentally violent and manipulative, characteristics that emerged in his relationship with the prison's health services. When Dolores Stroud, no relation, a nurse assigned to provide medical care in the isolation unit, declined his increasingly insistent romantic advances and his demands for special treatment, Stroud manufactured a confrontation that culminated in his stabbing her with a knife he had fashioned from laboratory equipment. A deliberate, planned attack on a caregiver that demonstrated his continued capacity for calculated violence despite decades of confinement. The assault on Nurse Stroud, while not fatal, was sufficiently serious to generate renewed calls for Stroud's execution and to prompt his transfer to the newly established Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1942, where he would spend the next 17 years in conditions even more restrictive than Leavenworth, and where his bird-keeping privileges were finally curtailed after he was discovered using his ornithological equipment to distill alcohol. The Birdman of Alcatraz mythology, largely constructed through Thomas Gaddis's 1955 biography and the 1962 film adaptation starring Burt Lancaster, emphasized Stroud's scientific achievement and portrayed him as misunderstood genius rather than violent recidivist, a framing that has generated substantial historical controversy. The reality encompassed both genuine ornithological contribution and persistent manipulative violence, including the exploitation of care relationships with nurses and other staff across his entire incarceration. Stroud died in 1963 at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, having spent 42 of his 73 years in solitary confinement, his case remaining significant for what it reveals about the complexity of criminal identity, the potential for intellectual development within institutional settings, and the particular vulnerability of healthcare workers to predation by incarcerated patients whose dependency creates asymmetric power relationships ripe for exploitation. The inclusion of Stroud among nursing-related killers requires contextual qualification. He was not a nurse, but rather a patient whose murders included assault on a nurse, representing the inverse of the professional predation that characterizes most cases in this documentary. However, his case illuminates critical dimensions of healthcare-associated violence often overlooked in discussions focused on rogue practitioners. The vulnerability of caregivers in institutional settings, the particular risks associated with solitary confinement and mental health deterioration, and the complex dynamics of care relationships in which dependency may generate not gratitude but resentment, manipulation, and violence. Contemporary healthcare security protocols, particularly in correctional and forensic settings, reflect lessons learned from cases like Stroud's, including restrictions on patient access to potential weapons, careful monitoring of care relationships for signs of inappropriate attachment or hostility, and recognition that intellectual accomplishment does not preclude violent propensity. The Birdman of Alcatraz mythology, while culturally significant, ultimately obscures a more disturbing reality of persistent criminality and exploited care, a cautionary narrative that complements the professional predation documented in the preceding cases and that completes this examination of how medical and care settings generate unique vulnerabilities for those entrusted with healing.